Deep within a remote wildlife sanctuary where the ancient trees stood tall and thick, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wild flora. Sunlight barely broke through the dead-end's canopy, casting the forest floor in shadows, where small creatures scurried and the leaves rustled with the wind. It was as a place untouched by human hands, where animals roamed freely and the rhythm of nature played out its eternal cycle. In the heart of the sanctuary there was an ancient oak tree, gnarled and towering, with roots that stretched deep into the earth, twisting like serpents beneath the soil. For generations it had stood as the quiet guardian of the forest, its branches reaching up to the heavens. The villagers living on the outskirts of the sanctuary often spoke of the tree, believing it to be a place of power, a symbol of the forest's strength. Many came to revere it, even though few ever ventured deep into the sanctuary's heart. But beyond the tree, hidden in the underbrush and shaded by the towering giants, a tortoise lived. It was a solitary creature, slow and steady, but with an ancient wisdom reflected in its eyes. The tortoise had lived by the oak for many years, and the space around it had grown sacred. A small burrow near the tree provided shelter from the elements, and the tortoise's life was one of quiet solitude. There was no hurry, no need to rush. The tortoise moved only when necessary, sensing the subtle rhythms of the world around it. The forest had always been a peaceful place, but something had shifted. Over the past few days, the wind had begun to change, carrying with it unfamiliar sounds, whispers of something ominous in the air. The usual chorus of birdsong had quieted, and the rustling of the underbrush had grown more frantic. Animals that usually wandered freely seemed to be disappearing, retreating to the deeper, untouched corners of the sanctuary. The once serene forest now felt charged, tense with the knowledge of something lurking just out of sight. The tortoise, as always, moved slowly along its familiar path. Its shell, worn by time and the elements, glistened faintly in the dappled light as it made its way toward the oak. Yet something felt different today. The air was heavier, almost suffocating. The forest's pulse seemed to have quickened, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The tortoise paused near the oak, its small eyes scanning the shadows. It had lived here for many years, but it had never felt such an unease in the air. The rustling in the distance was louder now, more frantic. The leaves trembled, and the usual quiet hum of life had vanished. A sharp sound echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, a crack like a branch snapping under pressure. The tortoise's instincts told it that something was coming, something dangerous. A low rumble seemed to vibrate through the ground, sending a ripple of unease through the forest. The tortoise froze, its ancient mind piecing together the puzzle of the disturbance. For a long time it had lived in harmony with the rhythms of the earth, but now the harmony was broken. It was as if a shadow had fallen over the sanctuary. The ground beneath the oak trembled again, this time more violently. The tortoise's eyes darted to the base of the tree where the roots seemed to shift as if alive. A crack appeared in the soil, widening slowly, revealing something beneath. The roots themselves, once solid, were beginning to move. Something deep below was stirring. The tortoise moved closer, its shell scraping the rough bark of the tree. Another rumble, closer this time. The tree groaned, its ancient branches creaking under some unseen pressure. It was as if the entire forest was bracing for something monumental. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the shadows, followed by the rustle of leaves and the snapping of branches. The tortoise remained still, its heart pounding in its chest. From the edge of the clearing, something large and dark emerged, a figure, low to the ground, moving with a strange, unsettling speed. The creature was massive, covered in matted fur, with eyes that glowed with a strange light. Its limbs were long, its claws scraping against the bark of the trees as it moved forward. The air seemed to shimmer around it, charged with an unnatural energy. The forest itself seemed to recoil. The tortoise, with its slow, deliberate movements, made its way towards the oak's roots. The creature seemed to notice it for the first time, pausing in its tracks. For a moment there was a silence, a deep, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. The tortoise, despite the threat, felt an odd sense of calm as it faced the slow, steady rhythm of its life seemed to contradict the chaos surrounding it, and it knew that it had to protect the tree, the oak, the heart of the sanctuary. A sudden flash of light, a blaze of raw energy, burst from the creature's eyes, striking the tree's roots. The earth shook violently. The tortoise recoiled, pulling its head and limbs into its shell. But the tree's roots were not as fortunate. The oak's once imposing trunk cracked, splintering down the middle. The creature stepped back, watching as the great tree shuddered and fell, its massive body crashing to the ground with a thunderous roar. The sanctuary was forever changed. But as the dust settled, something remarkable happened. A faint pulse, barely noticeable at first, radiated from the fallen oak. The tortoise slowly emerged from its shell, its eyes wide. The tree was no longer dead. Beneath its fallen form, the roots had begun to move, regenerating, slowly knitting themselves together. The pulse of life was returning, stronger than ever. The creature that had destroyed the oak stood frozen, its eyes widening in disbelief. It seemed to have underestimated the strength of the ancient tree's spirit. The tortoise, ever calm, began to move once more, slowly making its way to the heart of the sanctuary. But just before it could reach the roots of the tree, another sound broke through the silence, a subtle vibration, one that filled the air with energy. From the depths of the sanctuary, from the farthest reaches of the forest, an answer came. More creatures began to emerge from the shadows, drawn to the pulse of life. A chorus of sounds filled the air, growls, chirps, and cries that resonated with a deep hum of nature itself. The creature that had destroyed the oak recoiled, the realization dawning that it had unwittingly triggered a chain of events that it could not control. The forest, the sanctuary, was awakening, and it was not alone. The creatures of the forest, the ones who had lived in the shadows, the ones who had kept their distance, were now united in defense of the oak and the tortoise. A twist of fate had turned the balance of the sanctuary. The tortoise, ever the patient observer, had seen the cycle of life and death before. It knew that in nature there was always rebirth, always renewal. The oak may have fallen, but it had given way to a new beginning. And in the silence that followed, the tortoise moved onward, leaving behind the clearing that had once been sacred but now pulsed with a new energy, an energy born from the resilience of nature and the strength of the creatures who called it home. The tortoise continued its slow journey through the forest, its small form making its way across the darkened earth, each movement deliberate and calm despite the recent chaos. The air had shifted once more, though the tension still lingered. There was a new sense of quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching as life slowly, inevitably, began to reclaim its rhythm. The once towering oak, now shattered and broken, had become something entirely different. It was not just the corpse of a fallen tree. It had become a gateway, a threshold between what had been and what would be. As the tortoise moved closer to the ruins, the earth beneath it felt alive with a pulsating energy, as if the roots, though fractured, were still reaching into the earth below, gathering strength, preparing for something. The air hummed with a low vibration, resonating deep in the bones of any creature nearby. In the distance, a faint rustle grew louder. It was subtle at first, but soon the sounds multiplied. A cacophony of movement from all directions. The forest that had once been eerily quiet began to stir with life. Birds took to the air in a flurry, small mammals scurried beneath the fallen branches, and distant howls echoed through the trees. The sanctuary, in its own way, was waking up. The tortoise did not stop. It moved onward, its old eyes scanning the canopy, its shell brushing the edges of the overgrown ferns and ivy. The world had changed, but it was nothing the tortoise had not seen before. The cycle of life and death, destruction and rebirth. It was all a part of the grand natural order. However, the deeper the tortoise ventured into the heart of the sanctuary, the more it began to sense the full scope of the change. The land felt different, more vibrant, but also more volatile. The once gentle breeze that brushed against the leaves had turned sharp, like a warning. A distant shadow flickered at the edge of the tortoise's vision. For a moment it paused, its instincts urging caution. Suddenly, from the thicket ahead, a low growl vibrated through the air. The tortoise's eyes narrowed. The forest had always been home to predators, but there was something distinctly different about this presence. It was a looming threat, something far more sinister than the usual wildlife of the sanctuary. The tortoise had lived through many seasons, but the forest felt different now. Faster, hungrier. The growl intensified, and from behind a large fern a figure emerged, a large, dark shape that moved with an unnerving fluidity. It was a creature unlike anything the tortoise had seen before, its body sleek and muscular, its fur matted and tinged with an unnatural dark sheen. Its eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light, not unlike the creature that had destroyed the oak. This was something more refined, more intelligent, and far more dangerous. The tortoise, although slow and deliberate, knew it could not match the speed or strength of such a creature. It instinctively drew itself into its shell, waiting in the stillness, feeling the vibrations of the earth beneath it. The creature circled, its movements smooth and precise. The forest was its domain, and it knew the land far better than the tortoise could ever hope to. The tortoise, with its ancient patience, knew that to act rashly would be to invite its own end. Minutes passed, and the tension in the air grew unbearable. The creature, sensing its prey, stopped circling and crouched low, its eyes narrowing in on the tortoise's shell. For a long time there was only silence. Then, in a flash of movement, the creature lunged, its claws slashing at the tortoise's shell with an intensity that would have shattered weak. But the tortoise's shell was ancient, weathered by countless storms and the passing of many seasons. The claws scraped across the surface, but they did not pierce the tough exterior. The creature recoiled, momentarily thrown off balance by the resistance. For a moment, everything stood still, neither predator nor prey moving, only the sound of their breathing filling the air. Then, something incredible happened. The once silent forest began to respond. The pulse of life from the fallen oak, still faint but growing, rippled through the ground. The earth began to shift. From the broken remnants of the oak, a single root shot upward, twining around the predator's legs, entangling it. The creature snarled and struggled, but it was no match for the force of the ancient tree's spirit, which had begun to awaken from its long slumber. The roots tightened, pulling the creature off balance, rendering it immobile. The tortoise remained still, its shell firmly anchored to the ground as the earth around it seemed to respond to an ancient, forgotten power. The pulse of life had returned, but it had a purpose. The once vibrant and peaceful sanctuary had become a battleground, a place of survival where only the strongest could endure. The creature, now helpless, howled in frustration. Its glowing eyes flashed wildly, but there was nothing it could do. The earth held it in place, and the tortoise, ever the silent observer, felt no fear. It knew that the forest had its own rules, and these rules were being rewritten in this moment. The once quiet sanctuary was no longer just a haven for life. It had become a place of reckoning. And the tortoise, despite its slow and deliberate ways, had become part of the forest's intricate web of survival. The struggle between the old and the new, between nature's resilience and its hunger for renewal, played out before the tortoise's quiet gaze. It had witnessed the destruction of the oak, the awakening of the land, and now the rise of a new force in the sanctuary. And as the creature struggled, its strength fading, the tortoise slowly began to move again, its pace unhurried but purposeful. It was no longer just a witness. It was a part of something much larger, something that stretched beyond its ancient shell. For the first time, the tortoise understood that the cycle of life was not just a series of individual moments. It was a living force, ever-changing, ever-growing, and no matter how slow or steady one's steps may be, they were part of something far more profound. And so the tortoise moved forward into the heart of the sanctuary, where the oak's spirit had returned to guide the land. It was no longer a place of uncertainty or chaos, but one of transformation, of strength forged through destruction, and rebirth through quiet endurance. The tortoise was home, and the forest was forever changed. The tortoise moved steadily, its old limbs carrying it across the softened earth, the weight of its shell a reminder of its long existence. The forest around it was no longer the same. The once familiar paths were now overgrown with new, wild vegetation. The pulse of life had awakened, and every inch of the sanctuary seemed infused with this newfound vitality. As it trudged through the underbrush, the tortoise felt the presence of the ancient oak more keenly than before. The roots that had once seemed like mere threads now pulsed with an undeniable energy, weaving their way through the soil beneath the tortoise's feet as if guiding it onward. The ground beneath it hummed with a resonance that seemed to echo deep into the heart of the forest. The tortoise's steps grew more deliberate, more aware, as though the very earth was calling to it. There was a sense of purpose now, a weight to the journey. What had once been a quiet and simple existence had turned into something far more significant. The tortoise was no longer just a wanderer drifting from place to place. It was part of the cycle, an integral part of the land's rebirth, as if it had been chosen to witness this transformation. The trees around it had grown quieter, though not out of fear. The silence that filled the air was reverent, like the calm that settles just before a great storm. The tortoise moved through this silence, undisturbed, its focus sharp. The forest was holding its breath. And then the tension broke. There was a sound in the distance, a crack, followed by the deep rumble of earth shifting. The tortoise paused. The once still air now trembled with anticipation. The sounds grew louder, closer. Something massive was moving through the sanctuary, something that shook the earth beneath the tortoise's shell. The ground quaked beneath its feet, and the tortoise had no choice but to retreat, its instinct kicking in. But it did not scurry in fear. No, the tortoise had learned that survival wasn't about running. It was about enduring. The ground trembled once more, and the tortoise dug its claws into the earth, steadying itself against the shock. The movement ahead was unmistakable. Large, heavy footfalls. The tortoise's sharp eyes scanned the path before it, searching for the source of the disturbance. Through the dense foliage, the tortoise could just make out the shape of a large creature moving between the trees, a shadow that seemed to distort the light around it. The creature was huge, larger than any animal the tortoise had ever seen in the sanctuary. Its dark form loomed, a hulking figure that moved with frightening grace, as if it were part of the forest itself, and yet there was something wrong about it. The creature's very presence seemed unnatural, its body too massive, its movements too calculated. It wasn't just another predator of the sanctuary. It was something far worse. As the tortoise watched, its heart racing, the creature stopped in its tracks. Its head swung toward the tortoise, its glowing eyes narrowing. The air was thick with a palpable sense of danger. The tortoise's instincts told it to hide, but it knew the creature would see it regardless. The creature's gaze locked onto the tortoise, and for a long, agonizing moment, neither moved. It was as though time itself had frozen. Then, in a flash, the creature sprang forward, its massive form crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. The tortoise instinctively pulled into its shell, but it was too late. The creature was on it, its claws tearing through the earth as it reached for its prey. But just as quickly, the ground shook again, more violently this time. The earth seemed to split, and from beneath the soil, roots erupted into the air, thick and powerful. The creature recoiled, its eyes widening in shock and fear. The roots, ancient and mighty, surged upward, wrapping themselves around the creature's legs, binding it to the earth.